Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I'm Mario Savino, and I am one of the conveners of this second migration conference, ADiM-IntoME Migration Conference. Last one was last year, and actually there were previous editions with a different format, even before. I'm very glad to welcome you all and to welcome our distinguished speakers from all over the world. This edition has been very successful in terms of applications we received for the call. We got almost 200 applications. This time we had to select part of them, not all of them, and this is a good sign in the sense that we could improve the quality, and I'm sure that all the panel sessions will display it. And I was asking myself what's the reason why we had so many people interested in this conference. One possible answer is migration is very high on the public discourse, on the legal discourse, on the academic discourse. But perhaps there are other reasons for that. And I think a second one is this is a conference that is meant for young scholars. And the introduction of this parallel panel session is precisely meant to allow young scholars to get the stage, to present their research, and to engage in an open confrontation. Perhaps there is also a last reason that to me is very important, which is about pluralism of perspectives. Sometimes I got the impression that the legal debate in particular, the legal academic debate, is in a way imprisoned in a politically correctness logic. We all need to adhere to a certain vision because it's conducive to a certain political outcome predominant in the academia. I think this must be understood as a very open and free space for discussion. We all care a lot about human rights, we all care a lot about the rule of law, but we need to understand the complexities of this specific field of public law. And in order to do that, we need also to understand the reasons behind restrictive policies. We would wish a world with no borders, with free circulation for everyone, but this is not the real world we can live in. Reality is much more difficult, it's different, and as young scholars, and also senior scholars, we need to engage in a serious discussion about how to find a fair balance, just to quote the title of the book we are going to present in a few minutes, a fair balance between the different perspectives. Before we start this kind of discussion, let me just do the housekeeping note. This is a conference that was organized by the Academy of Law and Migration, ADiM. You should be familiar with it. On the back here of your badge, you will find not only the program, but also the possibility to join ADiM. It's free, so get the chance and connect with us in order to get all the updates on our events and the possibility of research we offer. This has been organized by ADiM, but it has also been funded or co-funded by the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on the Integration of Migrants in Europe, the acronym is IntoME, and by two national research projects, one on legal pathways for refugees, and the other on community sponsorship for migrants in Europe, COSME, that is directed and has Daniela Vitiello, my dear colleague Daniela, as a principal investigator. Several people are behind the organization of this conference. We have a scientific committee of several people, actually. One is Barbara Bello, who is going to chair the next session. Then we have Martina Galli, Francesco Gatta, Federica Passarini, Michela Tuozzo, Flavio Virzi, and again Daniela, and of course myself. And there are other people that I want to mention because they are the ones who allowed us to make all this possible. And these are promising young scholars that I need to mention because they gave us an enormous support. First of all, Giulia Del Turco, who managed almost everything, and she's the physical person behind the ADiM account. So when you write to ADiM, she answers usually. Then we have Niccolò Acquarelli, Alessia Bastianelli, Giampiero Cassola, Francesco Damosso, and Prevail. I took a note because I didn't want to forget anyone because really they deserve our warmest thanks. I stop here. I leave the floor to Barbara Bello. She will chair the first session, the first plenary session of this conference. Enjoy.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So thank you very much, Professor Savino, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barbara Giovanna Bello, and I belong to the teaching staff at the University of Tuscia. It is a very great pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to all of you joining us already here in Viterbo today. As always, this panel will be recorded and made available on the ADiM-IntoME website afterwards. The panel's topic of discussion is both urgent and resonant, especially for those of us who engage with migration-related issues and immigration law, not only as an object of academic investigation, but also as a matter of personal and professional commitment. As Professor Motomura poignantly puts it, there are people in the United States who are in many ways, more than one, Americans in waiting. Mutatis mutandis, thousands of migrants are knocking on the European fortress wall across increasingly material and symbolic borders. It is therefore with sincere gratitude that we welcome our distinguished panelists to this timely conversation and to discuss the newly published book, Borders and Belonging Towards a Fair Immigration Policy, in which Professor Motomura presents a compelling ethical framework for understanding borders. The book invites us all to analyze 10 foundational questions about fairness, sustainability, and human mobility, while also considering the intersection of migration with broader global challenges, such as climate change, economic inequality, and racial justice. Following Professor Motomura's remark, we will hear from Professor Jürgen Bast and Roberto Kerchi, after which we will open the floor for questions and reflection from the audience. Let me now introduce and welcome Professor Motomura, who is a teacher and scholar of immigration and citizenship at UCLA, with influence across a range of academic disciplines and in federal, state, and local policymaking. His book is one of his previous books, Americans in Waiting, The Lost Story of Immigration and Citizenship in the United States, 2006, won the Professional and Scholarly Publishing Award from the Association of American Publishers as the year's best book in law and legal studies. It was chosen by the US Department of State for its suggested reading list for foreign service officers. And with this, I turn it over to you, Professor Motomura, and again, welcome in Viterbo.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation to come here. It's really an honor to be part of this conference and to really be on this panel. The truth is, I'm more interested in what my commentators say and what you all ask for questions than I am interested in what I have to say. But I think it's probably useful if I give you a sense of what this project is about. This is a moment when migration policy is so fundamental and so central to politics in general around the world. It's certainly true in Europe. It's certainly true in the United States and many other countries. And so that's a bit of why I wrote this book. Let me tell you, just spend a few minutes first telling you about the book and why I wrote it. And then I tell you a little bit about the structure of the book. And then I'll give you just 5 thoughts that emerge from the book. It's just 5 of many, I think, but I think it'll give you a feel for what the book tries to do. So the truth of it is that all of my academic work, I think my whole career, has been a response or a correction to the inadequacies of my prior work. I write something and then I get to the end and I realize that really wasn't what I should talk about. I need to talk about something else. And I think my whole career, I've been working as a law professor, I've been working in the United States, but I've always been struck that there's always more that I should write about. And I'm struck that there's so much work that is done in migration that works in what I think of as a silo, just a sort of a narrow band of professional, personal, sometimes political commitments. So for example, lawyers concerned with refugees don't always talk to lawyers who are concerned with constitutional rights. Lawyers are not necessarily in conversations with sociologists, and sociologists are not necessarily in conversations with economists or philosophers, anthropologists or historians. And more generally, I think there are many people who work as specialists, but who do not write for generalist audiences. So there's that kind of disciplinary silo. There's also a political silo. I think a lot of people who write about migration are really writing for people who believe in their basic or share their basic political views. I think there are more silos that are geographical. People work on migration in the European Union without understanding how it might work out in another part of the world. And I think American academics can be notoriously narrow in that perspective. And there are many impacted individuals who are very deeply impacted by migration policy, but whose voices are not often heard. Or sometimes it can be heard so loudly that it crowds out other views. So a lot of what I'm trying to do in this book is to not write as a lawyer. I can't escape my past, and I can't escape what I know, but I'm trying to write for audiences. I write about the United States, but I'm trying to write in a way that makes sense, has some explanatory power to worldwide audiences. I'm also trying to find a balance between what I think of as realistic and what I think of as utopian. I think the premise I start with, the starting point, is that we're in a world where nation states are politically dominant. And so I don't start with a premise of no borders at all. But I also think that it's possible many people who are thinking about migration policy and accept the reality as we have it today are also not being idealistic enough. They're not being utopian enough. I want a sense of how it is that the world maybe should be 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Honestly, I don't know what that horizon looks like now. But it is the future, and I want to know where the North Star is. So this is why I'm writing the book. So I'll give you more of a feel for how that is structured by telling you about the 10 questions that the book is structured by. And some of these questions are central to some writing about immigration, but tend to be ignored by other writers. I'm trying to put them all together. And these are fundamental questions, but I think they're actually rarely asked together. The first question sets the tone for the whole book, which is, why are there national borders? Why not? And also to talk about other borders we have in our lives. Not just national borders, but there's a border around admission to a university. There's a border around the American Indian tribe. There's a border around a family home. And how's that different from national borders? The second question deals with, how should we treat people, millions of people worldwide who are fleeing very dire, seriously troubled circumstances in their home countries and are seeking refuge elsewhere. So there's a chapter on that and how it relates to the question of why there are national borders. I then pose the third question, which is something different. It's less about people coming from outside to seek protection in a new life, but it's more about who belongs in a society. Someone who's lived in a country, perhaps without legal status, but they have been in the country and belong to parts of that society in serious ways. So that's a question of belonging. That's the third question, who belongs? The fourth question is, I probe the choices in how you decide what your admission policy should be, how you decide who's let in. Is it for work? Is it for family? The United States actually has a lottery that allows 50,000 people to come in from countries that have historically not sent people in great numbers to the United States. So the fourth question is the choices in deciding who gets in. The fifth question is, how do we think about time? There's often a thought that there's temporary migration and permanent or indefinite migration, but what is that about? Why do we do that? Why do we think that way? And how do policymakers perceive time, but also how do migrants perceive time? I think there's a lot of migration that's labeled as temporary, but in fact is indefinite. What's wrong with that? And maybe nothing, or what goes into that? That's the fifth question. The sixth question is, what about people who are irregular migrants, who live in a country without lawful status? What's the fairest way to deal with that group of people? Is it a legalization program, or is that misguided, or is that not enough? That's the sixth question. The seventh question is the flip side of that, which is, what about enforcement? What role should enforcement play? What should the goals of enforcement be? When is a system enforceable? The eighth question is, what about people who are skeptical of immigration, who want fewer immigrants or no immigrants? I think a lot of the political left, at least in the United States, has not paid much attention to that question. And I think that, to put it in a nutshell, that's the reason we have the president we now have, I think, is because of the political opportunities opened up by that failure to confront that problem. So that's the eighth question. The ninth question is to investigate something that's very commonly heard, very often heard, but actually relatively little discussed in terms of detail and content, and that is, what does it mean to address the root causes of migration? People always talk about we need to address the root causes of migration. It's very easy to say, but what does that actually mean? What's realistic? What's unrealistic? What does the social science suggest? And things of that nature. And the last question, I couldn't figure out a good title for this chapter, so I just called it, What's the Big Picture? It deals with what are the injustices, the unfairness, the unethical things that borders enable, sometimes hide. And another question is how should history inform the making of immigration policy? Whether it's recent intervention in a military conflict or centuries of colonialism. How do you think about history? So you can see that this book is a very daunting project. It tries to tell, in a sense, everything I can think of about immigration in 100 and 63 pages. There's a really good book by the novelist Stephen King called On Writing, and he says every time you edit, you should reduce the size or the length of the manuscript by 10%. So I did that twice. This used to be a 200-page book. Now it's 163. But I spent 2 months just trying to re-examine every single word, so we'll see. But this project is a very daunting one because of the range of issues it covers. I felt like a pole vaulter who signs up for the decathlon. And all of a sudden I realized I'm not just doing my event. I have to run the 100 meters and the 1,500 meters and all the other things you do in the decathlon. So it's daunting, but I also felt that it was important to synthesize this work. In a way, I felt it's okay if I take a chance on writing the book. Okay, so what are some of the key points? I'll just give you a feel for the kinds of things that emerge from this. What I'm trying to do is to push back against what I think is conventional wisdom that is often accepted but not analyzed. I'm trying to advance, or from these 10 questions come some new frameworks for thinking about policy choices. And I want to connect issues that are often not connected. So let me just spend a few minutes in the time I have left explaining 5 ideas that come from this way of thinking about things. And I think you'll see that these 5 ideas are very much addressing the politics of immigration today. Okay, the first question is a very fundamental question, which is what does immigration law, or what does migration policy, what does it actually do? It's often viewed as a set of rules that distinguish outsiders from insiders. It's the legal version of the physical border. And in a sense, it protects insiders from intrusion, maybe even invasion by outsiders. But I think it's actually an incomplete view because that is one way to look at it. And I think it's acquired, I mean, every executive order that we have from President Trump has the word invasion in it multiple times. But that's not the only way to think about immigration. Immigration policy is actually what emerges from debate among insiders. Some people favor more immigration. Some people are skeptical or even hostile to immigration. But to see immigration law as a debate among insiders, it's about how to shape communities. And to see it that way, I think it leads to a more honest conversation. National security remains important, but it's just part of the conversation. It's the beginning of the conversation, not the end. It's not a huge, as we say in English, a thumb on the scale in favor of exclusion. So first question is, what does immigration law do? The second thing I'm trying to suggest here is that there are 2 kinds of claims that people make when they don't like an immigration policy. And I think it's really important to distinguish them. One is what I'm calling humanity claims, and one is what I'm calling belonging claims. Humanity claims will sound a lot like human rights, but it's basically what are challenges that are grounded in the idea that no human being should have to endure something, separating children from their parents, and parents from their children, leaving migrants to drown at sea. These are the basis for persuasive humanity claims. But I also think that the belonging claims are important, claims that are not based on being a human being who should not have to endure something, but also claims that are based on your belonging to a society, even if you do not have lawful status. So I think some legal cultures emphasize humanity claims and don't pay enough attention to belonging claims. I think that some legal cultures do the opposite. They emphasize belonging claims. This is true in the United States. I think in the United States, the emphasis tends to be on belonging claims and not enough on humanity claims. And to translate that into legal discourse, not enough attention paid to human rights. Both are important, and both can be asserted simultaneously in the same situation, but conceptually, I think it's useful to differentiate them. That's the second idea, belonging claims and humanity claims. The third idea is who belongs. the idea of belonging claims necessarily raises the question who belongs. And the intervention I'm making in borders and belonging is they're not based on belonging to a majority culture or a dominant culture, but belonging to some community or communities inside the country's physical borders. And this is an idea, and this has been in some of my prior writing, it relies only in part on legal status. It relates also to why you're there. In the United States, I think a lot of people in the United States are irregular migrants because of the function, it's a reflection of our labor policy and our immigration policy. And people pay taxes, people have children who under US law are citizens. And I'm focusing on belonging on the basis of functional, societal, and societal connections. Okay, fourth idea, how do we think about time? I mentioned this earlier. I think it's conventional wisdom that people start as temporary or they start as permanent, and they don't necessarily move. Even as I say it, I realize that's not really a description of reality, but some people think that there's some deception takes place that someone comes temporarily and they stay permanently. I'm trying to complicate that issue because I think it may make sense for policymakers to let in some people temporarily and to have them eventually stay. And people don't know what their plans will be. Some of this relates to integration, but I think we need to complicate and not accept this division between permanent and temporary at face value. The real question there is, what are the options for migrants to go back home? Not because they're forced to go back home, but because they actually have a choice. So the policies that bring in migrants either temporarily or permanently, or temporarily and then maybe they stay, that goes hand in hand with the policies that we have to address the root causes of migration and to really give people a choice. Okay, the fifth and last idea is what is the time horizon, not for temporary and permanent, but what is the time horizon for making policy? A lot of what we're seeing in a lot of countries around the world is decision makers making hasty judgments, trying to get immediate results that have some kind of positive reaction in the current election cycle. I think immigration was the biggest issue in the American presidential election of last year. But I think the tendency there is to avoid any type of engagement with fundamental changes and changes that have durable results. And I'll give you an example of this, is that these quick fixes are counterproductive. To think in the short term means that a lot of times people say, well, let's have an agreement with a country to give people an option to stay there. But what happens repeatedly is that people say, well, it didn't do anything to the rate of migration in the last year, so now let's take the money and instead of putting it into schools, let's buy guns for the Border Patrol. Let's outsource migration and control. And they don't promote the kind of nation building that's important. So I think this question of, this is why root causes is such an important part of the other questions. And this typically requires a change in the way we think about this in terms of transnational negotiation and cooperation. So those are just four of the ideas that come out of the book. I'm trying to convey a sense of what the book tries to do. There are other ideas that emerge, but I think there's some value in taking these 10 questions and instead of going deeply into one, think carefully about how they relate to each other. So that's the overview. I appreciate your patience, and I'm really interested in hearing from you and from my co-panelists about what's wrong with the book. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Motomura, for stimulating us all to reflect on the sociological dimension of the choices underpinning migration policy on the one hand, but so-called inclusion or integration on the other hand, in relation to pivotal topics as belonging to a community, real belonging, beyond the borders within the society. So it's my pleasure now to leave the floor to Professor Jürgen van Basten and to hear his reflection on the book. And let me introduce Professor van Basten, who is a professor of public law and European law at Justus Liebig University Gießen, Germany. He is the spokesperson of the research group Human Rights Discourse in Migration Societies, head of its coordination unit, and principal investigator of the legal research project Territoriality, Public Authority and Human Rights, the EU's border regimes. Previously, he was a full professor of international and European law at Radboud University Nijmegen, the Netherlands, and a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg. Most importantly, allow me to say, in May and June 2025, he is visiting professor at the DICE department at the University of Tuscia in Viterbo. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for introducing me and also for all the colleagues of this faculty which are currently hosting me, to my absolutely great pleasure. But first and foremost, let me thank the organizers for the conference, for the real honor to share some thoughts, to comment on this really highly important book. And I'm afraid I will fail to meet my accurate duty as a discussant to point out the critical points. I will mostly praise the book now and try to convince you that you have to read it. Because it's such a pleasant read, it's such an elegantly composed book, and it's so rich in substance that we could easily spend conference on every single chapter. Not a conference, but conferences on every single chapter, and that is, I guess, due to the fact of the person who has written the book. So, I could hardly think of anyone else who has the personal knowledge and the experience and the wisdom to write that book. So I try to find the strongest language which I could choose. And actually, I shouldn't spend my time either on talking about myself, but just as one personal connection to the author is that I first met him at the early stage of my postdoc career after he had just published his first books, Americans in Waiting, and I will get back to that book later, which essentially shaped my thinking about migration law and migration policy in Europe, because I realized some interesting convergences between the European experience and the US-American experience, but also certain marked differences. And that will also be my approach for my comment. Now I will simply share some reading experiences from a European perspective, because as Hiroshi rightly said in the introduction of the book is mainly drawn from experiences and examples of the United States of America, but it's not only made or written for Americans, but it's written for a larger audience, so it's not only, it's largely about the US, but it's not for the US. And in every single one of the 10 chapters, you find connections that are essentially the fundamental question with every migration regime, which every system of migration law had to find answers to. But still, I will share some observations where I found things surprising in a way, or marked, or where I had experiences of differences, or where I wouldn't have expected things as they are in this book, and share some ideas about what I've learned about ourselves in that against that background. Okay, let me start to briefly bring you on board and how the organization, what the very structure of the book is and what makes it so elegant. Actually, one has to criticize its title because it doesn't make that clear. So, okay, it says border, but that essentially means migration at large, because one of the substantive claims of the book is that negotiating the claims of, it's not only about them out there who would like to get in, what this metaphor of border transports or may imply, but it's rather quite often about conflicting claims of insiders. So that's, therefore, borders is taken metaphorically. It means migration policy, migration law at large. Okay, that's quite, that's not rare, but there's only one of the two core concepts on which the book builds, mentioned in the title. It says belonging. And yes, that's one of the columns on which the book rests, but it's actually two, what he calls claims. So these two claims are the lens through which all these chapters are viewed. That is belonging claims on the one hand and humanity claims on the other hand. And I try to explain a little bit now what I've learned about these type of claims, how they may function maybe a little bit different in the European context, and what the essential idea about these claims is will come across, I think, when I'm going to do so. Just a brief definition of how I had understood that, broadly speaking, is that humanity claims are those claims in order to avoid situations which no human being should face. So that essentially does not depend on whether you are an insider or not. And belonging claims are valid claims, or claims that can validly be made by various type of insiders, and oftentimes the struggle is over who is an insider and who can make that claim. You mentioned in your presentation belonging claims made by undocumented migrants who actually can oftentimes have claims to be insiders, although the law does not recognize them as such. So these two claims organize the book. I have essentially three observations to share. The one is about the issue of the degree of legalization. The second one is about how these claims are defined by Hiroshi. And the third one is an observation by way of example of maybe a point of convergence. Okay, starting with the observation that Hiroshi introduces these claims as the two utopian elements in his book. So the entire concept is be realistically utopian, realist utopia. Realism requires us to accept the very fact that there are borders, but that doesn't prevent us from finding ways to make them more fair, to improve the borders rather than fighting against their very existence. But he also claims to be utopian. Then he says these are the two utopian elements in the vision of a world in which humanity claims are and belonging claims are respected. This is something that transcends the world we actually live in. Yes, these claims are being made in various contexts of day-to-day struggles, and they're part of our legal world. But there's something which is beyond this. I find it an intriguing labeling of these two claims, since we in Europe, well, I will always oversimplify now Europe, but we in Europe tend to make that type of claims as legal claims. And more precisely, we tend to translate these claims into claims of human rights law. You acknowledge, and you say that in the beginning of using the language of human rights is one way of articulating these claims, but the book is not about human rights law. It's about claims that can also be made in the legal context, and it's quite surprising, taken from the US experience. I'll get back to that at the end, how little these claims are part of the law as it stands in the United States of America. But if you put it simply, that was the first thing I did when I made my notes, when the definitions of humanity claims and belonging claims were made. Yes, yeah, Article 3 and Article 8, that's easy. That's the European Convention of Human Rights, that's how we do it. So that's part of our everyday legal doctrine, how we discuss issues of asylum policy, where non-refoulement is at the center of it, and Article, yes, this idea of that someone's interest in staying and have a legal status, well, that's reflected in the jurisprudence of Article 8 and family claims and so on. You know all that stuff. So there's a surprising degree of difference that I myself, as a European, that's more cautious, would have phrased the whole thing as a human rights claim, as the one way of thinking about it, and thereby implication also perceiving it as something that is within the law, whereas the way you put it, these claims are actually outside the law. So they can be used to make claims towards the law, but they're somehow rather seldom are seen, are presented by example, by your US American examples, pardon me, as part of the law. That's my first observation. We've learned something about us. We think about the same things much more legalized in the language of human rights. The second thing, what I would like to share is two aspects of where the very definition of these claims, how you presented them, were, let's say, a little bit different from I would have expected it. The first thing is that may also demonstrate for us that this legalization thing may have its pitfalls. Namely, that you oftentimes make the convincing point that these two claims may overlap. You mentioned various situations, let's say immigration detention, where people who challenge such a situation of being detained for administrative purposes of immigration law can both make humanity claims and belonging claims against that type of policies or measure. Whereas I'm, as a European, maybe we Europeans tend to more compartmentalize these things. We put different numbers on it, 3, 8, 5. But then we think in legal silos rather than seeing that both aspects of humanity and of belonging might be at play. That is one aspect where I found the definition revealing, let's put it that way. The second aspect, it was even more striking, my surprise, that you consistently use the concept of communities, the plural, when defining the ties that lay the groundwork for a belonging claim. Belonging to a community in a society which consists of communities, that enables you to identify that answering to belonging claims of some persons may at the same time disregard the claims of others, or so that these claims are not related, or not necessarily related, to a larger homogeneous community in the singular. And that's oftentimes the way we conceptually see it. We ask the question, do these migrants belong to, are they already insiders in our national community? And maybe at times we conceive of the European Union as some type of community. But your point of view is asking as to whether there are ties to smaller sized communities that may, even if I understand it correctly, be a particular family. So, whereas the society at large is not seen as a relevant community. And if you think of the jurisprudence on Article 8, that's not how the court does it. So it thinks as to whether there are ties to the host state, host society, thinking of it as a consistent whole. That I find really revealing and also very attractive as an idea. As to my final observation, sharing my reading experiences, concerns one of the chapters where you are dealing with temporality, so versus permanent residence. What I took as one of the lessons of this Americans in Waiting book, also a very fantastic book, is this lost story which you have told in that book of the early days of the country of immigration in the United States, that there's a legacy of treating newly arriving persons as Americans in waiting, as someone who is in a presumably short period of transition of being a citizen, and therefore, well, why not letting them vote once they have filed their papers pending their naturalization claims? So the idea that newly arriving people should be seen as citizens in waiting, but almost citizens, and be treated as such. And in this case, I found, I marked the difference to how we do it in Europe. We usually get a limited permit, and then we renew it, and then we renew it, and maybe at some point you qualify for an unlimited permit, and maybe for citizenship. So that was one of the differences I realized. And I was surprised to learn the much more lenient approach, much more favorable approach, which you adopted in this book here when it comes to temporary statuses. That granting persons a temporary residence might pave the path for future development, but should not be seen as a deviation from the ideal, but rather could be one of the means how we could move towards utopia by realistic means, but you still make the valid claim, which I find really convincing, that even if persons are newly arriving on a temporary basis, their status may be precarious, maybe their status may not even have been decided upon. We should still treat them, normatively speaking, that's the utopian element. Normatively speaking, we should treat them as if they were on their path to being permanent. So treat them as Americans in waiting, even if they are asylum seekers. Or that's the normative idea where you did not deviate from your original idea. And say, with this, let's say, more favorable view of temporality, maybe that reflects some kind of convergence between the European and the American experience. So that's one thought I had. Final remark concluding that's a more shaky ground on which I am yet. I turn the tables. Is there something that the US might learn from Europe? Maybe. maybe Europe has something to contribute to a period which seems quite distant today, namely the period of post-Trump era when reconstruction starts. The day will come, and the damage has to be assessed. It may be huge, but the day will come when all this ends, and the political forces will be to reconstruct. I use that term deliberately, but referring to the US-American history after the Civil War. So, and certainly there is no way back to the status quo ante. So it doesn't make sense to think of the fight which has to be fought as something of the return to the pre-Trump area, but rather reconstruction has to face I would say, the flaws which the system had before, that may even have contributed to what had happened after. And one part of such a reconstruction may be the potential of legalization of these utopian claims, of making belonging claims and making humanity claims. There is added value to make such claims part of the legal system. And maybe the United States of America will need to have much like after the first Reconstruction, amendments to its constitution that constitutionalize certain belonging and humanity claims. And maybe there is added value in having an outside system of control in the form of a supranational court. When all mechanisms break down internally, that there's still something which helps to improve from the outside to support such belonging and humanity claims, maybe ratifying a treaty that gives jurisdiction to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights should be one element of the post-Trump reconstruction. That would be my suggestion. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Professor Bast, for this insightful presentation and raising a lot of questions also concerning the law in action, not only the law in the books, which is very hotly discussed in Professor Motomura's book. And now turning it over to Professor Roberto Kerchi, let me introduce Professor Kerchi, who is Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Cagliari. He has been visiting professor at the Universidad Abierta Interamericana in Buenos Aires and visiting scholar at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. He is a member of the scientific committee of the series Law and Migration, published by Editoriale Scientifica Publisher, and of the journal Immigration and Citizenship Law. Together with Professors Savino, Benvenuti, and Biondi Dal Monte, he coordinates the COST Lab established within the Accademia delle Migrazioni, Academy of Migration, directed by Professor Mario Savino. Please, the floor is yours. And maybe, okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me first of all thank Barbara Bello and Mario Savino for the kind invitation that I received this honor to be a discussant of the most recent book of Hiroshi Motomura. It's a book that raises questions and gives some answers, the answers of the author. I selected some of these questions, and also I tried to create some schemes that could help me in summarizing the basic concept of the book, and also hopefully that could help you to understand. The first question, why borders? Why borders? The author points out that there's a good and a bad in the borders, because the good is that borders may foster integration social and political cohesion. They can assure protection. The bed of the borders, basically, it turns out to be the effect of the rule of law, because in the borders allow injustices that are not allowed inside, and these injustices turn out not to be detected or unremedied. So the author points out about, affirms that there is basically laws inadequacy. And this very important concept is based on those claims that have been already introduced. So the law seems not to give an answer to humanity claims and to belonging claims of the migrants. I have been I've been puzzled by this kind of concept, because myself I thought maybe we should, as a European law scholar, I'm used to think of fairness and justice connected to human rights. But also I remember another book of Hiroshi Motomura that he points out that the rights that are protected by international conventions usually give a minimum standard of protection. There would be also, I would say, the possibility of a protection through a constitutional scheme, but we will get to this point afterwards. So, in order to lead you in the book, I need to introduce some concepts that are related to the status, immigration status in the United States, because there is a clear difference, a clear distance in between the long permanent resident, the lawful permanent resident, and the undocumented. But in between, we have other statuses. The non-immigrant, for example, the temporary worker or the student, and also some status that are called in-between status. For example, parole. Persons that are not admitted as refugees can be paroled into the country. It's not a matter of formal admission, but they are paroled. Also, TPS, a temporary protection that is very similar to our European protection that has been applied to the Ukrainian forced migrants in 2022. And DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, again, an in-between status that allows to stay without being formally admitted, if understood well, the children that were brought at a young age in the United States by undocumented parents. So we have different status, and some of them are in between, in the blur of in this between. Now, the schemes that I announced are basically 3 schemes that can lead us to understand some of the concepts of the book. The first scheme is contract. It's not clearly used in the book. It used in other book, or it used in other books of Hiroshi Motomura. Basically, it's the concept that only somebody that entered, that crossed the borders legally, it is a legal, lawful resident, has signed a social and political contract with the state. The conditions of the contract are clearly put out by the state. It's a kind of a contract of adhesion. The consequence of this idea is that inequality is admitted. Inequality is admitted because it depends on the contract that you have. The contract of a lawful permanent resident is different from the contract of a temporary worker, and the undocumented have no contract. And this idea of the contract comes out in some decisions of the court, even some recent decisions. For example, again from another book, it's Hoffman Plastic, in which an undocumented worker was illegally fired, but the Supreme Court decided that he had no right to back pay, because giving him a right to back pay, like all the other workers, would have meant to undermine the effectivity of immigration law. But also, Hiroshi Motomura also in another book, points out that, well, the concept of contract has encountered an evolution in time. It's no more not only an exchange of will. It can be a contract of adhesion. Sometimes contracts are not the effect of an exchange of will. Sometimes contracts are the outcome of behaviors of the parts. And I think this concept is very often pointed out in this recent book. For example, at page 82, millions of people work without papers with some degree of government tolerance, acquiescence, or invitation. Again, page 132. The US immigration system tolerates, acquiesces in, and even invites people to live and work without status. So a kind of a social contract could be thought even for undocumented immigrants. And maybe there is an example, if you understood well, of what might have happened. The Bracero program in between the 1940s and 1960s, it was a program through which many temporary workers coming from Mexico were admitted, especially in the southwest of the United States, as farmers, basically, working in the farms. But the program was stopped in the mid-60s, but clearly it was a program on which there was a reliance both of the owners of the farms and of the workers that were relying on this program for having a wage and a living. So this second scheme to understand some concepts of the book is transition. It's already been pointed out by Jürgen Bast. What do we mean with transition? Well, first of all, transition can be the transition from one status to another. For example, from the status of a temporary worker to lawful permanent resident. Reasoning through the lenses of the contract, this would not be possible because you've been admitted on certain conditions. One example of transition, the US Senate approved a bill in 2013 to let many temporary workers become lawful permanent residents if they had residence and employment for 10 years. Also, transition as a pathway towards a lawful permanent residence and citizenship can be thought also for undocumented migrants. It's called legalization. There's one example, the IRCA IRCA 1986. It's interesting, Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, was president but didn't veto the statute law. Well, this law consented the legalization of millions of undocumented migrants. And a type of legalization is the legalization of individuals, for example, the cancellation of removal that is possible only for 4,000 persons per year. Maybe the suggestion of the author, it could be expanded. So again, transition. The third scheme, or maybe the magic words that are very recurrent are ties and connections. Ties and connections are what characterizes the relationship with the territory, with the state, of the insiders. And Professor Motomura affirms that these ties and connections should be fostered. Family ties, for example, rendering easier the family reunions. And also there's another way of fostering ties and connections, anticipating the integration, giving the citizenship in an easier way. The examples are the 14th Amendment of the Constitution that gives the citizenship even of the children of undocumented immigrants when they were born in the country. Also, it could be made naturalization easier. We have a referendum in June, so we will see in Italy. And also dual citizenship, because sometimes, integration is a process of building ties and loosening other ties, and it can be demanding, challenging also for the immigrants. So allowing them to keep two citizenship can be a way of fostering ties. Okay, a key word in the book, discrimination, on the basis of nationality, ethnicity, and religion. Why it's a key word? Because the most successful challenges towards immigration law have been led in the 60s and in the 70s using the scheme of the civil rights movement of the 60s. Motomura introduces us to three very important precedents. Graham, the Supreme Court applies a strict scrutiny on laws, state laws, Arizona and Pennsylvania, that limit some social benefits only to citizens, excluding non-permanent residents. The Supreme Court affirms there has been a discrimination of a discrete and insular minority that the Constitution protects from discrimination. Another example, Plyer versus Doe. The US Supreme Court decision affirms that the children of undocumented migrants have a right to attend the public schools, so they have a right to education. And the legal reasoning is based on this concept. The court makes clear that it viewed the children as part of a country's future. So discrimination means basically applying the Equal Protection Clause. Another scheme that comes out from the laws from the civil rights battles is the due process clause, especially the procedural due process. London versus Plasencia. Plasencia is a lawful permanent resident that is being excluded at the border after a trip in Mexico. The Supreme Court affirms that she has a right to due process. She has a right to be heard in a fair trial and to have a fair chance to tell her side of the story. But more recently, it seems like there has been a revival of an older approach, which is the late 1800s approach in the Chinese exclusion case, which is called plenary power, which means deference towards immigration law and immigration decisions by the courts, even the Supreme Court. A revival, especially I would say two decisions that are quoted. Trump versus Hawaii, the Supreme Court refuses to follow the courts of appeal that affirm there has been a discrimination on the ground of religion because it bans the travel from 6 Muslim majority countries, and evidently it's applying a deferential approach. Or Department of State versus Munoz 2024, the Supreme Court affirms that you can be married, you have the right to marriage, but the right of marriage doesn't imply that you have a right to live with your husband or wife or same-sex partner in the territory of the United States. So one of my questions to Professor Motomura is, what's the state of the plenary power doctrine? Because I read many articles during the years that said the end of the plenary power doctrine, the erosion of the plenary power doctrine. Another key word, discretion. Discretion in border control and immigration law practice. This is a very important issue that can explain to us why Professor Motomura has doubts about the rule of law referring to immigration law. Because, in fact, it's a rule of law that releases to border officers a huge, a very wide discretion. So what could be the remedy? For example, centralizing these decisions. This has happened in the DACA program. And also making clear which are the priorities in applying immigration law. Recently, I think it was the first mandate though, President Trump affirmed that there had to be no criteria, no preferences in applying immigration law, which means a huge discretion on the immigration officers. Humanity claims arise also, as well as belonging claims, when we talk about detention. For the author is an euphemism of imprisonment. Another flaw of immigration law, the lack of due process is a problem throughout immigration systems. Criminal penalties, they are too harsh, especially considering that some of these immigrants may have been invited. Privatized enforcement that undermines transparency and accountability. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm heading to the conclusion. I want to point out one thing, that also words are very important from the author, and I completely agree with him. For example, words and symbols, I would say. Border crisis, using the word crisis is not proper, because we tend to think that when there is a crisis, the crisis has to be fixed, while instead these are structural phenomena. Or again, walls, it's a symbol. Most pertinent to discrimination is that the Trump administration's plan to fortify and build out a wall on the US-Mexico border was a symbol of animosity towards the Mexican migrants. Amnesty, when we talk about legalization, many skeptics affirm that it's not legalization, it's an amnesty for people that have violated the law. It reminds me a sentence that is in another book of Professor Motomura, Immigration Outside the Law, which is the part of the word illegal that you don't understand. So it evokes clearly a very harsh approach in applying the immigration law. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for this second presentation. And agreeing with Professor Motomura, we start now to collect some questions from the audience, so that then there is time for the reply to all the many questions that have been raised. So, please, Professoressa Vitiello, coordinator of the course on security and human rights here in Viterbo.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all thank the speakers and the organizer of this amazing first plenary session. I really appreciate the discussion and the complexity you raised around the idea of migration policies. And I would start from the title, because in the title of the book, Professor Motomura mentioned the idea of a fair immigration policy. So I'd like to reflect a little bit upon the notion of fairness, because of course, as we heard, the scope and content of fairness in immigration policy is dependent upon history, politics, geopolitics. Professor Bast also added that the language of human rights can provide some structure, and I do remember a leading scholar around 20 years ago telling us that international legal norms on migration are like substance without architecture. Is this affirmation still valid? Is my first question. How does the answer may differ in Europe and in the United States, and what role could be played by the courts in shaping and giving some architecture to this patchy migration law? This would be my first question. The second is about compartmentalization, which has been raised by Professor Bast in relation to the divide among the two claims. so the first claim is based on universalism of human rights, which, however, may turn integration into assimilation and then cut out any pluralism, especially cultural pluralism. The second claim is based on a different conceptualization, so the genuine link, the connection, which can be functional or societal, between the individual and communities, in plural. I would ask whether do you think that the new Pact on Migration and Asylum is a way to cope and to overcome the compartmentalization of migration and asylum policies in Europe, and unifying in a way the two claims, making them less dichotomical. And last but not least, about the root causes and right not to migrate, which has been raised in the global compacts, this idea that people should not be forced to migrate, right? So about that, my question would be, do you think that migration is a natural phenomenon? It's a little bit provocative, I know, but do you think that the idea of a right not to migrate, not to be forced to migrate, connected to the root causes, so that we have to help them at their own place, avoiding the migration journey, may advance a vision according to which migration is the pathology, while not the physiology of human life? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these questions, and let me also thank Dr. Giulia Dal Turco for helping us collecting questions. Professor Savino.
May I add a few questions for Professor Motomura? It's a wonderful book. It's very easy to read and very thoughtful and very balanced in each chapter. I declare from the outset that my favorite is chapter 8 on how to take the skeptics seriously. I think that is the key for most of us who care about solutions, not just problems, but also solutions. But let me start with 3 questions. Your book and the new Trump administration. The book was finished before then, right? So how would you change it if you would write it now? Would you change it substantially, and especially with regard to the rule of law, which is part of your book? This is my first question. The second is, how do you see asylum in 20 years from now? Having regard to the EU context, my sense is that if the restrictive agenda we design through the new pact fails, and I think it's not a remote possibility, it's a concrete possibility given the bad performance we have with return processes. If it fails, my sense is that Europe will end up to fundamentally revise its commitment to the Geneva Convention, its commitment to process all the asylum claims of people showing up at the border. And I guess, in some respects, the US are already a step forward in that direction. Am I wrong? And the last is about the reasons for that. I mean, what is wrong? Let's put it bluntly. What is wrong with the liberal migration agenda in the global north? I was listening to a New York Times podcast, Interesting Times, and the name of the podcast is Interesting Times, and they were interviewing Vice President Vance. And he was making this point. He was saying, look, the Democrats think that our migration agenda is shaped by racial hatred. But actually, what we care more about is social cohesion. So my question would be, does the liberal agenda on migration take sufficiently into account this value, social cohesion? Thank you.
I think it's time to start replying.
Well, those are great questions, and I think answering all of them would require a new book. But they're also fair questions here. And I made some notes about the questions, and forgive me if I don't address them all, but I'll try. And my colleagues some of the questions were ones that they could address as well as I can. Let me start with something relatively straightforward, which is how I would write this book differently now, knowing what's happened in the last 120 days. At some level, I would not write it differently, because I think what I'm trying to do is imagine some basic principles and some ideas. And they look at the year, I used to think it looked at the year 2030. Now I'm thinking maybe I'm looking at the year 2050. But the ideas are the same. What's different is that I think I would have marked pages differently. I would stamp a page. This is what relates to this executive order. And in fact, I'm writing some shorter pieces now that say, here's my take on what Trump has done from the perspective of the author of the book. Okay, so in that sense, okay. So let me go then, Daniela, to this question about fairness, which is, I think, your first question. You know, I've been trying to think about how the book, in some senses, tries to take a position, but I admit, in many cases, in many spaces, in many pages, it doesn't take a position at all. And I think it's because what really troubles me is a process of decision-making that is not transparent and that is, I think, is not fair. In other words, what I'm saying is that there's a contest among people who live in a country. Some people favor more immigration, some people don't favor more immigration or want to stop it. And so what I'm concerned with is the process and whose voices are heard. So I'm really concerned about borders. I mean, Roberto, you said this, is sort of how it conceals you know, a certain kind of injustice. And so what I'm really interested in is the terms of the discussion. So what troubles me about saying immigration is always about invasion is because, well, I mean, it might be, but there are many other ways to look at it. And to cut off conversation by saying it's invasion is too narrow. That relates, I think, to this whole question of integration and why isn't my focusing not on one community, a uniform community in the country, but why different communities? I think that I'm looking at a more pluralist vision of who's in a country, but I'm not a hardcore person who thinks in orthodox multicultural senses. I do think cohesion is important, but I think cohesion comes from a certain respect for different cultures. And I also think that the dimension of time is very important because so much integration is judged, I think, in many countries around the world based on things like language acquisition by the immigrant generation. But I think that's actually relatively unimportant. Well, I think what really matters is what the children and the grandchildren do and how many of them acquire English or Italian or German or whatever the language may be. And so I'm thinking about a world in which it's enough to belong to a community, one of many communities in a country, but oftentimes the story of a country, at least of a country of immigration, if that's the self-concept, is the story of the first generation actually speaking the old language at home, but the second generation going to university, and the third generation, you know, becoming much more successful. And so I think the dimension of time is really important in addressing this question of community or communities. So these two questions link together because what I think is fair, which is to listen to people respectfully and to listen to all people who are directly affected as belonging to communities in the society. That notion of fairness is very much related to the skeptic's question. Because I do think that the question of how, I think a lot of the American left, I'm speaking just of the United States, has really not paid much attention to the economic troubles and concerns of people in locations where the industries are suffering. And I think that neglect created a situation where it was hard to, where it was easy, I suppose, for someone like Trump to say, I'm standing up for you, and Joe Biden is not. And I mean, it's complicated because I think the real things that would make have an effect would be actually quite structural. There'd be investments in education, but I also sense that the Democratic Party and the presidential candidate, I mean, Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, was not paying enough attention to the political vulnerability that was created. And I think that's a very important thing, which also then gets back to the question of social welfare, because I think that, you know, I think that a lot of the American left, at least, is very concerned about economic equality, but didn't, and really wants to believe that you can have coexisting migration and a welfare state, but they want everyone to have a voice in that welfare state. They don't want to so at least my concern is that the social welfare idea will be used as a weapon to restrict immigration, when in fact it's much better to have the kinds of immigration we have now, or more, but to redistribute the prosperity that immigration brings. And I realize that, like I said, this could be a whole book, but let me just give you a short answer to another specific question you asked. What's the future of asylum? I think what we're seeing in Europe, and certainly in the United States, is a diversification of protection mechanisms. We have traditional asylum with a path to citizenship, but we also have subsidiary protection or temporary protected status or parole, and a rethinking of refugee admissions. It rethinks fundamental questions. Is it permanent or temporary? Which just raises that chapter, right? Is it on a group basis or an individual basis? What's the degree of national cooperation? I think we're going to see much more, and we need much more international cooperation on this issue, but it's also not trying to fit everyone into the refugee, not refugee box. And I think it's important to see refugees as potential workers too, and not just workers in this generation. It's not just looking at workers as only, it's not like looking at newcomers as only workers. I think that I also want to think about this generationally in terms of the children of the workers. So those, believe it or not, are short answers to very fundamental and wonderful questions.
Before concluding, we are approaching the conclusion of our session.
Yeah.
But
maybe only one. Maybe you said one. Maybe only one follow-up to your second but last point, answering essentially to Mario's question. Indeed, I also think that the very existence of this chapter 8, dealing with migration skeptics, as one of the fundamental tasks of 10 of migration law, is to the point, so that doesn't have to be left out. That's one of the arguments there. But also in terms of substance, I tend to agree with Hiroshi against Mario. I got you right. So he precisely does not make the point that we need to show some more restrictionist policies in order to convince the losers of migration. That's not the point Hiroshi makes. And I agree with him that the idea of sharing immigration prosperity, I'm quoting, sharing immigration prosperity is the answer. So that to consistently make the point that migration generates wealth, but also unequally so, and that's essentially an issue of redistribution. And pro-migration forces need to be seen taking care of that. So that's not only that, substantively speaking, does redistribution have to happen, but also pro-immigration politics necessarily have to take the concerns of the losers of immigration seriously. And that's a point I would fully support.
I would point out a theme that is in the book, which is the relationship in between immigrants and other insular minorities, like for example the Mexican or the Hispanic minority, and also the Afro-American minority, because for example in the book Professor Motomura affirms that the Afro-American minority seems to appreciate stronger border enforcement, but it's also a minority that is very, very into the fight for anti-discrimination laws. So, in relation to the Hispanic minority, because we've had a chat in 2013 when we first met, it seemed like that the first victory of the first or second victory of Obama was determined also by the Hispanic vote, which could be considered a vote of people that tend to be attached to traditions, that go to church, which could be conservative votes. So what I would like to know from Professor Motomura is something has changed in the relationship in between these minorities, especially the Hispanic one, and the community of immigrants, referring to immigration law and of course of the outcome of the last elections. Thank you.
So I know we're out of time, so I would brief. I first just really want to thank all of you for your attention, and also for all the conference organizers. I want to thank you, Roberto and Jürgen, for these wonderful comments. I'll just make up, to answer your specific question, I think a lot of the economic precarity that people feel has really changed between 10 or 15 years ago. And I also think that economic precarity has been a more unsettling feeling because of the migration flows have changed since 2015, as we've seen in this part of the country as well. I think that changes the politics. I just want to make a general observation and in a sense, thank you for I think there are two really big themes in the comments you're both making, because, I mean, Roberto, you were asking about specific aspects of law and understanding sort of exactly what drives some of the things we have. But Jürgen, you're raising a different but related question, is how do the way we think about policy translate into law at all, right? There's a reason why I didn't use the term human rights. Part of it is because I wanted it to be above or outside of law. Sometimes these ideas are in law, sometimes they're not. And also I didn't want to get into debates about all the academic debates about what is human rights. I just avoid that. But I think it's part of what's going on are different ways to understand two different, parts of the world, in a sense, with very common issues, but some of them have to do with different legal rules, and some of it have to do with the relationship between legal rules and broader arguments that are made in society. So that's just kind of a way of understanding, at least how I was hearing a lot of the richness in the commentary. So I'm very grateful for that.
And I would say that there is, as I understood, there is a very last question for you.
Okay.
And
thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Jelisaveta Blagovic from University of Montenegro. I'm very glad to be here today and grateful for this opportunity and hearing all of you. I have just one question because I'm a political scientist, and my question is going without borders of immigration policies areas and going to immigration territories. Like, as I understood very well, the last chapter of the book is dedicated to maybe causes of migration flows and the reasons why we are dealing with consequences in all different countries, especially here in Europe, after conflicts and civil wars in Middle East and North Africa. And in that way, my question is what about policies of great powers and global poverty policies that are contribute or in some way cause the conflicts and the main migration flows? Thank you very much.
You said cause the conflicts? Oh. Okay, so I have a confession to make, which is that discussion at the end was one of the most difficult ones to write, because the realist part of me thinks that the realistic politics of immigration will not allow immigration policy to be used as a zone of reparations for all of the injustice in the world, whether it's colonialism, imperialism, or economic and capitalist hegemony. On the other hand, I had just in several chapters talked about why history is important in judging exactly who should get legal status, especially with regard to U.S.-Mexico relations. And so I actually had a dilemma in writing that chapter, which is that there are many ways that history and the causes of migration can be taken into account, but it can be a political judgment about where on that spectrum you want to be, right? So I basically say I think that asylum policy should reflect military interventions by country. I also think that legalization should reflect economic policy and labor policy toward sending countries. But that's the part that is not just utopian, but I think realistic. I totally understand and conceptually and analytically appreciate the argument that a lot of people have migrated on account of events in world history. I want in this book to identify that spectrum, and then this goes back to this question of voice, is to really have an argument about where on that spectrum is correct. Because I think the world is, so much of the political polarization is between people who say that history controls everything, and on one side, and the other argument is history should control nothing. And I'm trying to get those two sides into conversation with each other. So this is yet another way in which I'm kind of, I was about to use an American sports metaphor, but punting, which is basically to say, I'm not sure where on that spectrum the idealistic or the utopian and the realistic converge. I just don't think we talk enough about this. I mean, we see this in the debate about reparations for African American slavery. Everything that says, I have no responsibility for the past, to, I want to completely rectify everything. I just don't know where that is, I confess. But you raise that's a super important question.
Well, that we will continue our conversation over a coffee, and we are all invited to join for coffee, but let's thank our panelists. Thank you very, very much. So we meet here, if I'm not wrong, in half an hour. 30 past 4. 4:30 sharp. And again, enjoy the coffee and enjoy the days here in Viterbo. I had so many questions to ask you.